Very good. Okay. We'll welcome everybody to today's local government education program on the Community Reinvestment Act, or CRA, as it's more commonly known, brought to you by University of Illinois Extension and Rural Partners, the voice of rural Illinois. My name's Mike Delaney, and I am an Extension Community and Economic Development educator. I'm based in Ogle County up here in the Northern State Line region. We'll begin with a few housekeeping notes, familiar to most. We will be recording today's webinar, and at the conclusion of today's presentation, registered participants will receive an email with a link to the recording on our YouTube channel, as well as slides from the webinar. If you didn't register in advance for the webinar and would like to receive the materials, that's great. Please put your email into the chat box to let us know that you'd like to receive those materials. I'll note that if you desire, you can activate Zoom's closed captioning function at the bottom of your screen. As always, you're welcome at any time to share your questions in the Zoom chat space. We'll review the questions in a Q&A period at the conclusion of the main presentation. Now I'd like to introduce Ann Silvis, who serves as a member of the Board of Rural Partners and also wears the hat of Assistant Dean for the University of Illinois Extension. Ann?
Thanks, Mike, and thanks for the introduction. Jason, it's nice to see you again and nice to have you here. The reason that we thought this would be a great topic was when you began talking about changes to CRA when we were at the Rural Development Conference in Springfield. So I really appreciate you being willing to provide a lot more information on the topic, and we've gathered an audience, so it's great to have you here. I'm wearing two hats, as Mike said. I work for University of Illinois Extension, but I'm making the introduction on behalf of Rural Partners, the Illinois Rural Development Council, and I'll put a link to our website in the chat when I finish. But it's great to be here. Thanks, Jason, so much for joining us.
Thanks, Ann. Now, we'd like to welcome to this webinar series our presenter for today, Jason Keller, a Director of Advisory Services at Wolters Kluwer Compliance Solutions. In this role, Jason manages a team of regulatory consultants who develop and deliver advisory services related to fair and responsible banking, including compliance with the Community Reinvestment Act. Jason spent over 20 years working for the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, where he most recently served as the Community Economic Senior Advisor at the Federal Reserve. Jason, the microphone is yours.
Well, thank you, Mike, and thank you, Ann, for the opportunity to talk here today. And I'm based out of Chicago, longtime resident of Illinois, and very excited to be part of this conversation. And I really want to make this as conversational as we can in a Zoom platform. So if the chat is open, please put a question in. I'll try to get through as many of those as we can at the end, but also I do have my contact information at the end of this presentation. Feel free to message me afterwards, and I'm happy to walk through what you're looking to get more intel on. But I want to open this with really the title of this slide, and that is really how banks can be impactful and responsive, because the Community Reinvestment Act is currently in the process of being modernized. So I've been spending time on CRA for 25 years, and there's really no way to condense 25 years worth of learnings in a 50-minute presentation. But what I can focus on is the things that are changing and the things that are what I believe are most important for the diverse audience that the partners and the University of Illinois Extension would be most interested in. Because there's a lot of nuance in this new reg, and there's a lot of details, a lot of inside the weeds that we can get into. But I tried to structure my remarks here today to be more at the macro level, and really, whether you're in government, whether you work for a bank, whether you're a community group member, whether you're in the ag space, whether you're in the business space, I'm hoping there can at least be a few takeaways for each of you as a result of this conversation. Next slide, please. So really when we think about the interagency supplemental rulemaking, a lot has happened since March, but in reality, a lot has been happening over the past 5 years. The Community Reinvestment Act was originally established in 1977 to help financial institutions, to encourage financial institutions to reinvest in the markets from which they take their deposits. And as we start to think about what a modernized CRA rule looks like, we have to understand that this is a legal process. And right now, there is a standard that is in place that puts forward a modernized CRA, but the agencies themselves are in the process of getting sued, right? They're in the middle of a legal proceeding that will take months. So, but we have to remember from when CRA, again, the purpose of where CRA began. And where I really want to focus is the second bullet that talks about the changes around what a facility-based assessment area is and what information is available publicly. But none of this is important other than that you have to remember that CRA is a very public regulation. It draws on how banks lend and serve and invest in the markets from where they do their business. But more importantly, this rating is public. This is really the only place that a bank's performance is put out in the public sphere. And that is important because CRA is meant to be circular. It is meant to be what I define as a playbook. It is not a checklist. It is not something that you can go through item by item and essentially put forward information that the public will gain access to. It's really sort of, again, a circular element of what a bank does, but the input that government has, the public has, the research community may have around what is taking place. So yes, CRA is in the process of being modernized, but it's really the important factor of what's changing that I want to stress. So next slide, please. So everything that I'm going to say here today is really of my own opinion. We can't think of any of this as legal warranty. We can't think about any of this as something you can hold banks accountable to. But again, as a 25-year expert in this, I think I have some things to share that may be of value. But please note that nothing in here is legally binding. Next slide, please. So what is Wolters Kluwer? So I work in an organization that offers a lot of technology-based solutions to help financial institutions, government entities, and others further compliance. And again, based in Chicago, but I am not in the business of selling software. What my business does is sell advisory services to financial institutions, but we use what is called our Wiz suite, our CRA Wiz, to help institutions do this. But at the end of the day, my focus is very mission-based. My goal is to further bank compliance, but also ensure that low and moderate income populations, individuals of color, individuals that may receive Social Security or are focused on marital status issues to be able to put forward the best CRA product possible. Next slide, please. So everything that I'm going to talk about today is an overview of the CRA itself, where we are in the modernized journey, and then a summary of the interagency fund. Next slide, please. So where to begin? I want to focus on who will be impacted by the CRA changes, what financial institutions need to do to prepare, where institutions will be evaluated, and then how the agencies themselves will look at CRA performance. And even if you were not part of a bank, even if you were, again, a part of another group or focused on entities outside of banks, I believe there's some key takeaways that you'll walk away from this presentation on that will further your mission in throughout Illinois. Next slide, please. So what are some important dates? The important dates are really at the bottom of this slide, is that as of right now, the final rule that was originally supposed to be in effect on January 1st of 2026, there is an injunction against that date. So as the regulators work through with the banking associations and some others around what needs to be worked out, there will be day-for-day compliance that will be pushed back. So as of right now, here at the end of May, we now have about 90 days, or essentially between 60 and 90 days, where the rule will be pushed forward. So until all of this comes to some level of resolution, financial institutions are still responsible for complying with the current rule. And while it's important to be able to focus on what banks have to do under the current rule, I want to have a future focus because this is where the biggest changes are that could impact and will impact residents of Illinois. Move forward, please. So what is new? You're going to see in this slide that a substantial portion of the new rule has new definitions. And a lot of these new definitions fall under section 13. And all of this is meant to show you that a predominant percentage is new. There are a certain number of definitions that were revised. Other definitions were revised with no substantive change. And we have a very small percentage that were redefined or removed. So again, my goal is not to make anyone on this call a CRA expert, but my goal here is to show the gravitas of how many new definitions there are in the CRA way, or what there might be as a result of the new changes. Next slide, please. Now, some people look at the pie chart and say, well, that's great, Jason. Tell me what the new definitions are. And everything under section 12 that are new or net new to 12 under section 13, all of these bullets are revised or are all new definitions. So you're going to see there's even a new definition of affordable housing. There's a new definition of what a deposit is. There's a new definition for what a metropolitan area is. There's a new definition for what a native land area is. The list goes on and on. This is what comprises that percentage. What you're going to see in the revised box are those definitions that have just been revised. So what is a small farm loan? What is a home mortgage loan? What is a branch? All of these are really put into play to show the importance of the evolving nature of what our banking landscape does. We have to remember that, again, CRA, founded in 1977, did not focus on a digital footprint. When CRA was last revised in 1995, it was not focused on a digital footprint. So everything that you're seeing in here is a product of how banks are changing and how our society is changing and how individuals are doing their banking. Next slide, please. The most important element of those revisions, and again, not to get too far in the weeds, is what I call the 11 categories of community development. And in these 11 categories of community development, we have to note that under the current rule, there are 4 definitions. So you're going to see that on the left-hand side of this page. There is currently a definition of affordable housing. There is a definition of economic development. There is a definition of community services focused on low and moderate income. And there is a definition of revitalization or stabilization. There are 4 categories in which banks right now, under the current rule, have to meet their obligations. But these definitions are very focused on what large banks do. So what large banks do, if their assets are greater than about 1.6 billion in assets, they have a requirement to meet these definitions of community development. But what is changing is these 4 definitions are moving these definitions are moving from 4 categories to 11. So in these 11 definitions, now you're not going to see all of them here because there's some subsets, but the affordable housing category is moving from 1 to 5 subcategories. The economic development definition is moving from 1 to an expanded list. The community services is actually changing to now be called community supportive services. And revitalization is now moving into 6 categories around place-based activities, which throughout Illinois, I think there's just going to be a lot of new opportunity for banks to invest in this place-based category. And I'll get into some more detail here. The other ones that are new are activities with qualifying organizations. So those are minority depositories, women depositories, low-income credit union, and are what are called community development financial institutions, or CDFIs. Now, the bottom one of this, I think, is what's most exciting, and this is around financial literacy. Financial literacy is something the regulatory agencies have long been focused on, but now there is a specific carve-out of what is going to be happening from a community development perspective. But all of these categories, again, will be based on asset size. So financial institutions that have less than $2 billion in assets aren't going to have to be focused on these new 11 categorical elements. This is really just for financial institutions that have greater than $2 billion in assets. But the important part of this is not to, again, become an expert in CRA, but the importance of this presentation is to give you ideas of how your institution, your organization can interact with banks on these new 11 categories. But even if you say, well, wait a second, Jason, the final rule isn't in place, we don't have to worry about these until 2026 or 2027. And the short answer is that is true. But you still have to interact, or those of you who do business with banks can still be working towards the 4 categorical elements on the left-hand side today. So if you are working in elements of community services or revitalization stabilization, I'm going to give you some hints to think about as you move forward. Next slide, please. So let's get into the affordable housing category. So again, there's 5 elements that go into that category, but it's still affordable housing at the end of the day. So if your organization works on the housing front, most likely if you're working in affordable housing, this is going to give sort of more detail for the banks of how they're going to engage with you. But at the end of the day, it's really still just affordable housing. If you are working in economic development and you are working specifically on this notion of small business or small farms, the most important thing here is that you're going to want to shift your focus to those entities that have less than $5 million in gross annual revenues. And you're likely going to say, well, most of the businesses or farms that are operating in Illinois are under that $5 million threshold, and that's a good thing. But this change to CRA is going to put more focus on what is a small business and what is a small farm. Now, community supportive services. This one is different because it's going to provide a non-exclusive list or non-exhaustive list of examples of how you're supporting LMI individuals, and LMI being defined as low or moderate income. This is really the point of the presentation that I want to stress what has not changed. CRA is very much focused on the income level of the person being served. It is not focused on race. It is not focused on gender. It is not focused on age. It is not focused on veterans. It is not focused on individuals with physical or mental disabilities. All right. It is all focused on the income level of those borrowers or those participants. However, there are now going to be specific carve-outs for certain mission-driven organizations or those organizations that serve that cohort to get credit under the CRA. So while CRA is still not going to be on the basis of race, there are still elements to work with minority depositories or those individual organizations that may serve populations where race and income or gender and income are now going to be more closer linked. So this is an important change, that it's not changing the focus to be race-based, but it is going to be providing more, or I would call a stronger linkage to those entities. When we start to think about the place-based activities, I want to stress the importance of what a targeted census tract is. And there's a lot more or new metrics around what is an area that may be having focused on that may have historic levels of poverty. There may be a greater focus on those areas that have been impacted by a natural disaster. There may be more impact on those place-based activities that are going through some sort of economic shock because of a pandemic. So as you start to think about the place-based activities of where these entities do their business, CRA will serve as a greater tool. And when I say CRA will serve as a greater tool, I want to emphasize that CRA is one strategy. CRA is one strategy that financial institutions use to meet the needs of their marketplace. But all of those activities can be done with qualifying organizations. So you can focus on where they do business with women or minority-owned depositories, again, CDFIs. But it is opening up a very large window to have structured focus between banks and government, banks and municipal entities, banks and states, banks and counties, banks and cities. If you go down to the township level, there are opportunities to work in any of these categorical elements with your elected officials or appointed officials that are also having the same mission you do to increase financial literacy, to focus on economic development, to focus on community development. So if nothing else, what you take away from this slide, as CRA modernizes, the banks will have a larger window, a broader window to do business with you that increases the benefit to targeted populations. Next slide, please. So what is a community development loan? And for those of you in the banking world, there's really not much new here. But for those of you not in the banking world, I want to focus on what a community development loan is and is not. Under the new rule, a community development loan can now be a legally binding commitment to extend credit. And this can also be a standby letter of credit. And standby letters of credit are important because they may only be drawn upon if there's a certain need. But we have to remember that a community development loan excludes basic lending to a low or moderate income person. So it's not a one-off mortgage. It's not a loan that meets a certain geographical component. These are typically bigger dollar loans that are outside of what a bank would do on a basic loan transaction. Okay, so this might be a loan that fosters growth to enhance workforce development. This might be a loan that develops an emergency fund in case in a period of drought or a natural disaster. These might be transactions that entities can draw upon as a result of a pandemic or something that draws or that creates significant risk from an economic standpoint. So, but from a housing perspective, this might be very much focused on affordable housing, where a county may come to the table that says, well, we want to have an affordable housing program that serves 100 families in XYZ community over the next 12 months. And we need a bank partner to foster that transaction. That is something what a community development loan would be. Next slide, please. What is a community development investment? Now, this is also a legally binding commitment to invest. It could also be monetary or in-kind donations that support community development. And those monetary or in-kind donations might be in the form of new computers. They might be in the form of using different technology to foster human resources at a nonprofit. Or this might be the opportunity to give dollars towards a specific shelter or a food bank. All of these things can be counted under community development financing. An investment doesn't necessarily have to be for a rate of return, and it doesn't have to be a less than market return. There is nothing in community development. I want to make sure that everybody is clear on this. There is nothing in community development that says a bank has to lend, invest, or serve in any organization, in any transaction that they believe is not safe or sound, okay? So while there are some philanthropic components to this of what a foundation might do or what a nonprofit can do, if a bank believes that the transaction or the proposal does either not meet the requirements of the bank or doesn't serve the community or is run by someone who may have an ill reputation, there is no requirement that a bank has to invest in that loan program, in that financing program, in anything, all right? But the carrot of doing this, again, that these transactions are going to be more visible in the public space. But if a bank decides that it does not want to invest in something, now the receiving entity may be bitter about that. They also have the ability to file a complaint or file something with the government that says, hey, this bank did not invest in my program, and then the government could look into that. But at the end of the day, this is all about positive reinforcement. This is about positive reinvestment. This is about positive serving in those communities. And if you're involved in low-income housing tax credits or new market tax credit programs or other programs that invest in a Main Street revitalization or something that fosters rural economic development, these are things that your bank partner is going to want to know about. Next slide, please. So the reason I stumbled on that last slide, there is now a specific carve out for what are called community development services. Now, these community development services are activities that promote community development, but these are actions, these are hours, this is board service. So examples, this is credit deposit or other personal and business services that reflect the expertise of the employee or the board member. So this could be legal, this could be HR, this could be IT, but all of these things have to be done on behalf of the bank. All right. So if an individual works at a bank, but they donate their time for their daughter's little league, that may not necessarily qualify because that little league isn't furthering the needs of low and moderate income populations. However, if that same individual serves on the board of the little league, and there's a fundraising component that raises money from the concession sales that goes to the local food bank, then that activity would be qualified for CRA. So everything in CRA is what I call structured storytelling. It is all about telling a story of how a bank participates in the community needs on behalf of the bank. So activities that raise money for the locals or activities that are foster growth for the spaghetti dinner or for the fundraising effort that may qualify on its surface, but it's more detail that is necessary to serve or to put forward to the regulators of how an activity does or doesn't qualify. It's the storytelling that talks about the impact. And that's really where I want to spend the rest of this presentation, is around the impact of these activities. Next slide, please. If nothing else, we want to focus on where CRA is changing. And activities that are changing is around the full or partial credit category. Right now, regulators are looking for banks to essentially say how their loan, their investment, or service have a 51% benefit to lower moderate income populations. That's the de minimis, okay? But oftentimes there is not a prorated component to that activity. So what the new regulation will do is offer full credit under these categories. But I want to really focus on bona fide intent. This is where institutions are not going to be able to, financial institutions are going to have to talk about how a certain activity has the bona fide intent of meeting a service, and it was specifically structured towards community development. So what this is trying to avoid are activities that may have been given credit in the past where institutions complied by accident, right? They didn't necessarily know what they were investing in, and they would go to the chief investment officer and say, well, give me all your investments and let's see if we can have any of those meet the definition of community development. Under the new rule, banks are not going to be able to do that. They're going to have to show that their activities in the community were specifically structured or intended to meet those 11 categories that I talked about previously. Now, to a well-run CRA program, this isn't going to be much of a change. You've always done this. But for those CRA programs that may struggle in this area or haven't had buy-in internally, they're not going to be able to have these things pass what I'll call the litmus test or the smell test around what is community development. Now, there is going to be some partial credit around affordable rental housing when a loan, investment, or service doesn't meet that majority standard. So what that essentially means in English is that if there's a certain housing complex where 30% of the units are affordable, that means that the bank would get credit for 30% of their investment in that rental housing complex. So even though it didn't meet the majority standard of being over 50, they would still get credit for 30% of those dollars. So to me, it's a great way to not have an all or nothing standard, but that majority standard is still important. But I want to stress the importance of that bona fide intent category for everybody on the call here today. Next slide, please. So what is full credit? Now, full credit are activities that support community development and meet the measurable benefits. So this might be, again, for affordable housing, and the beneficiaries or the proportion of those dollars in those categorical elements. So again, if you're still making loans, investments, and services, or banks are still making loans, investments, and services where 51% can be proven, then you're going to get credit for the entire amount. But I want to focus on this notion that if there's still benefit to LMI status or those individuals that qualify as low or moderate income, or those businesses that are small, then I still believe that you can prove the majority standard. But all of this, the proof will be in the pudding around that documentation. Next slide, please. Now, this is really where I want to spend the rest of my time, because I think this is what's of most criticality to residents of Illinois. and really all states, but I want to focus on Illinois. So what is new? What is brand new out of the new reg are 12 factors that banks will get credit for as impactful. Now, impactful means a lot of different things to different people. Sometimes it might be on the level of complexity involved in that transaction. Sometimes it might be how innovative a certain transaction is. But I'd really stress the first bullet, which is the responsiveness. If there is a designated market need in a community and a bank steps up and says, raises their hand and said, we will respond to that need, that's where I think the impact factors will come into play. But it's not necessarily based on the number of hours spent that is going to make something impactful. You can't say, well, I spent 20 hours on this. That was a lot of time, so I think it's impactful. I want to make sure that how these factors are documented is really what you take away, again, from whether you work at a bank or you don't. This is where I think the communities can work together on these impact factors. Next slide, please. Now, here, the first three impact factors, I believe, are ones that can be documented with numbers, can be documented with math. The first one is activities that serve counties that have poverty rates greater or equal to 20% for over 30 years. Now, those counties are out there. They're in the public sphere. I do not know how many of those might be in Illinois, but I know there's at least a couple. However, even if you don't meet the 30-year threshold, you can still focus on census tracts that have poverty rates of greater than 40% in a given census period. So looking at the 2020 census, going out and saying which are those census tracts that are significantly impoverished, this is where activities where banks can really step up. But the last one is one where it's a little bit fuzzy, where it's areas with low levels of community development activities. Now these can be both metro and non-metro areas, and banks have the ability to sort of say, well, wait a second, there's not a lot going on here. We believe we're serving an unmet market need, and our competitors are not doing businesses in this area. So we can document this from a perspective now. And I think that low level, folks, there is no numeric level yet to that low level. There will be more metrics in the future, but again, this is in the future rule. Next slide, please. Now, the next set here are 5 impact factors that are working with certain types of organizations. So again, if a bank is working with a CDFI, it qualifies. If a bank is working with a low-income credit union, it qualifies. If it's working with a minority depository, qualifies. If it's working with a women-owned depository, qualifies as impactful. But the last one, you're going to say, all right, well, we don't have any of those in our market. But what you do have is the last bullet. The impact factor that regulators will assign will be if there is volume of activities with business and farms with gross annual revenues of less than 250,000. So remember what I told you, that the focus is really now on businesses and farms with gross annual revenues of less than 5 million. If you are specifically working with entities that have less than 250,000 in gross annual revenue, that is specifically impactful. That's exactly where I think the growth opportunity is for the kind of work that the partners do and the kind of work that the extension does, and focusing on growth for small businesses, those truly smallest of the small. Next slide, please. The last ones don't focus on businesses, but focus on certain populations. So this is where the income level of that area is essentially low. So low-income individuals, the lowest of the low. But this is also note that you have activities with families or households. And what is the difference between median family income and median household income? You can have multiple families living in one household. You can't have one household living with one family. So that being said, if there are specific activities that you are focused on the lowest of the low, that is, again, specifically impactful. Native land areas. Now, if Illinois doesn't have a large number of native land areas as designated, and I know there is not, there are still pockets of those individuals who may identify with tribal descent. If there are specific products or programs or services that focus there, this may be an activity you can think about to be specifically impactful. Now, the last one is one that I want to focus on what is a high opportunity area. And these high opportunity areas are designated in a couple of different ways, but the focus is on affordable housing in those markets, but also the idea of general economic growth. And I know Illinois does have several high opportunity areas as designated that you may want to focus on. Next slide, please. Now, what are the additional ones? And these ones are actually my favorite because they offer the most opportunity for that storytelling. Now, remember where I said that banks can get credit for grants and donations as CRA, but there is no de minimis on how big those dollar transactions have to be. So if there's a $5,000 donation, if it were particularly impactful, that story needs to be told by the bank. If there was a certain level of bank leadership, whether it's multifaceted in more than one form of support or different levels of engagement, how did the bank serve in a leadership capacity? We have to remember that all banks over $2 billion in assets are going to have to prove this. I do want to state, though, that credit unions do not have to comply with the CRA. All right. So as you start to think about how you network with institutions throughout Illinois, focus on those institutions with greater than $2 billion in assets. Now, credit unions may have specific categorical reasons of why they'd want to comply with the rule, one of which might be their ESG standards or their corporate social responsibility. All of those things may be counted, but just remember that they are not subject to these rules. The last one I want to focus on is innovation. Now, innovation is neat in addition to the LIHTCs and the new market tax credits, which you can see above. But I want to focus on innovation here because it's specifically important to say, how is a bank putting new products or services into a given place? What strategies do they have over the next 12 to 24 to 36 months that says they are predicting where a market need is going to be? The idea of innovation is subjective, right? There is no market number that talks about the importance or the numeric factor of how innovation can be quantified. So everything around innovation is qualified. It is around that storytelling. It is about the ability for that bank to say, if not for our participation, if not for our product, if not for our service, then this need for low and moderate income populations or small businesses would not have been met. This is where banks need those nonprofit partners. It needs the research arm of the extension. It needs the rural partners to come through and says, bank, we have an opportunity to leverage dollars that may come from a state program, may come from dollars from a federal program. It may be in conjunction with other banks. What level of innovation is needed is all in the eye of the beholder, but this is where the storytelling, where you're matching the numeric piece with the subjective piece that says, because of this bank's participation, X happened. If it wouldn't have been for this bank's participation, Y would not have happened. This is where the impact and responsiveness, this is what I want all of you to take away from this conversation here this afternoon, is that there is an opportunity to show impact and responsiveness in everything that you do. Next slide, please. Now, what's going to happen in the future? I don't know. All right, so the regulators will come out with supervisory guidance. They will issue some examination procedures. They will provide some training. All of this is sort of on hold until the litigation comes to be. Now, if you work at a bank, it's important to me to get your data reporting guide set up, to think about what information you're putting out to your partners, if there are templates you are using, if there are data tools. Wolters Kluwer offers a lot of this to you, but there are other services out there that can help. We are following the future rulemaking. One thing that I didn't mention is that the regulators will be putting forward an illustrative list of qualifying activities. And what that list will be is not a list of organizations that qualify. It'll be a list of those things that a bank can do to receive CRA credit. So there is a draft of that out. It was put out by the OCC or the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency. So at least you can see that of what it may look like, but there's going to be changes. It is not the final. The regulators will also be putting out thresholds and a set of benchmarks in more detail on what those responsiveness factors might look like. But Wolters Kluwer will be following that, and I know the bankers on the call will be following that. But for those of you interested in learning more, feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to provide some links and additional tools. But at the end of the day, I don't know how all of this will look in the future, but I'd like to be very much focused on not only do the banks have to comply with the current rule, but we have to remember those impact factors and those 11 categorical elements are not in play today. Those are future focused. Next slide, please. Now, here are the things that we know. We know that there will be new data collection, reporting, and requirements. We know that the assessment area definitions will be changing. We know that there'll be an illustrative list. We know that there'll be new reporting requirements for small business loans and small farm loans. We know that depository institutions will have to report new data on their depositors if they have over 10 billion in assets. And we know that there will be some level of impact and responsiveness that we just talked about. The timing of any of these, we have no idea, okay? We have no idea when any of this will happen, but we know that it is on the radar. But the uncertainty is, we now know that the Supreme Court has just ruled on the constitutionality of the CFPB's funding. So we think that this will create a little bit more of an accelerated timeline on this, but we don't know when those benchmarks will be published. We don't know how institutions will self-assess their own performance, and we don't know how many smaller banks may opt into being examined as a large bank. So all of this to be said is that these are things that people like me think about, but for the most of you on the call here today, if there's nothing else to take away, know that CRA is changing, and there's a lot for banks to have to digest, specifically if they're over 2 billion in assets, but if they're over 10 billion, there's a whole lot of change coming. Next slide, please. So what are the action items? If you are a bank, you need to understand those terms. You need to understand how your bank will be subjected to these changes, and you need to be mindful of different rules and things that come out, but I know you do this anyway. For the non-bankers in the room, find some bank partners that you can talk to about how they are meeting their community development needs. Talk to them how they may be interested in partnering with your organization. If you work for a research entity like a college or a part of a think tank, think about partnering with a bank or a community group to do some research and put some of the quantitative elements down on paper so they'll able to use those results to be able to further the mission of the CRA. Next slide, please. Now, every year, Wolters Kluwer puts on a CRA and Fair Lending Colloquium. This year, we will be at the Omni Orlando at the end of November. I only put this forward as an opportunity to come and learn about CRA modernization in much greater detail. There is a brand new nonprofit rate associated with attendance this year. So if you're interested, you can go out and kind of look at that, or I can provide you some more information. But I just wanted to do a quick commercial for the colloquium. We typically have about 1,000 individuals or more come to this, and there are bankers, nonprofits, government entities all represented. Next slide, please. The other neat thing about the colloquium is you can put forward recommendations for topics and speakers. And there is also a community impact award. So if you are working for a nonprofit or you are working at a bank, if there has been a product, program, or service you believe has been very much impactful in your area, you can put that forward to be consideration. It's self-nominated, right? You don't need to have somebody else nominate for you. You can nominate yourself and then potentially be recognized at the event. Next slide, please. So I realize this is a whole slew of information in about 42 minutes, but I just wanted to set the primer of how complicated CRA is. And I could have spent a lot more time on sort of what the standards for compliance are today. But if nothing else, know that CRA is in the public space. You can walk into any bank or go to any bank's website and request information about how they are meeting the needs of their community. Whether they send you something in paper or they direct you to a link, you will be able to learn more about how that bank is doing. I will tell you that over 99% of the banks in this country are rated satisfactory or above. There are 4 ratings within the CRA space. Outstanding is the highest, and substantial noncompliance is the lowest. but 99% of the banks in this country are rated satisfactory or above. The new rule will change that curve. There isn't a mandated bell curve of what the regulators are hoping for, but at the end of the day, the new standards that banks will have to comply with, this is likely why they are involved in some litigation, is to change those standards. But at the end of the day, I think it's critically important that entities throughout Illinois work with the banks that are here. We have some very strong institutions. We have some very thought-provoking institutions. We have some very strong CRA officers and strong banks that invest in the markets in which they serve. So with that, Mike, I will stop and see if there's any questions that came through, or if you'd like to open up for any text chat. I'm happy to do that as well.
Thanks very much, Jason. Appreciate the tremendous and substantive content that you've provided. I think we've got one question to kick it off. It's a multi-part question. In regards to the different CRA tests and evaluations, two questions. First, do you anticipate any requirements that may inadvertently deter banks from doing certain activities for LMI populations? If so, do you have any recommendations on how financial professionals or, excuse me, or partnering clients may overcome barriers that may exist around these requirements? Second part of the question, can you comment on any other barriers in meeting measurable benefits and how to navigate any of those? Take the first question first.
Yeah, I have answers to both. When we start to think about unanticipated consequences or any sort of negative externalities, I am concerned that because the regulators will be putting out an illustrative list, that banks may shy away from doing anything that isn't on that list, that some of their innovation may be stifled as a result of them not getting guaranteed credit. I don't know if that will happen, but that is a concern that I have. And because of so much of this will now be metric-based, I am concerned that if banks reach a certain threshold based on what the metric tells them, they may say, well, yeah, we're very good on this side of the river. We don't have to invest as much. We're not very good on the other side of the river. We need to spend more time on the other side. Now you're going to say, well, isn't that the point, is to get more dollars on the other side of the river? We're north of 110th Street. And the short answer of that is yes, that could lead to some positive results. But I don't want activities to sort of be stifled on one side because the numbers say that a bank is in a good position. I think there is a certain feeling test around CRA, and that's where these impact factors become critically important. The second part of the question is a little bit more complicated, is that, how can institutions address any other barriers? And the barriers here is that there is no incentive to be rated outstanding in CRA, okay? It doesn't result in lower FDIC insurance. It doesn't result in more deposits. There is much more of a stick associated with CRA than a carrot. And the stick is that if you were rated less than satisfactory in CRA, here's what happens, is that municipalities may pull out their public deposits. Banks may be limited on their merging, acquiring, or opening and closing of branching activity if you're rated less than satisfactory. Or if an institution is deemed to be non-compliant from a fair lending standpoint, so if they have issues in how they lend to females or lend to minorities or lend to senior citizens, that will lower a bank's CRA rating by default. And that also then means that more time will have to be spent on complying with CRA because it's in the public space than necessarily addressing other sort of lending activity. So all of this being said is that CRA is a playbook, okay? It's not a checklist. There are certain levers that can be checked off that helps a bank improve its CRA performance, but a lot of them are interrelated. And the more financial stress that a bank could be under, the less likely they are to put dollars and resources into the CRA.
Understood. Yeah, challenging. We've got another question coming in, and please, if you have any other questions, feel free to deposit them in the chat space. At this point, while we still have a couple minutes left, I'd like to queue up a one-question poll for our attendees just to get your response to our performance today. And we will then move on to the next question. If the new assessment areas that banks are assigned to are for some reason not viable, how might the CRA performance benchmarks be affected or nuanced? It's great that the timing is unknown because they'll have to see what those nuances are. Any that you have perceived so far?
Yeah, so these benchmarks is what's creating all the regulatory angst because banks are very much focused on what they have to do to comply. But we have to remember that CRA right now is a retroactive regulation. So a bank that is examined in May of 24 is actually having their performance evaluated of how they performed in 22 or 23 or even going back to 2021. So this notion of what a benchmark will be on a future focused basis, there's no way for the benchmark to account for what may happen in the future, a la a pandemic, a la a natural disaster. So this idea of how banks will perform in the future on a number or a set of metrics that can't account for future life occurrences, I think is a problem, right? It's just going to be a problem. And plus those metrics are unknown. The regulators have to do a very robust set of analytics to determine what is an appropriate amount of performance in a given place, but that's going to be based on retroactive numbers. So it's almost it's counterintuitive that says, well, let's set up a set of standards based on what happened, on what we think could happen, but evaluate what banks actually did to happen. So it's a past, present, future that I think is creating a lot of angst within the regulatory community.
Yeah, a little bit of crystal ball gazing. Sandy Dieters has posed a question that had occurred to me as well. As a nonprofit housing counseling agency, we provide many services in literacy, pre-purchase, foreclosure, and eviction prevention to LMI families. What's the best way to approach banks to form a partnership? Generally, maybe speak to strategies, since so many of our listeners and the viewers for this podcast or webinar will be community agencies and community leaders. Talk about strategies that you alluded to it toward the tail end of your talk, but perhaps expand upon that a bit more. What strategies might these community agencies use?
That very, very good question, and thank you for that. The best thing to do is to obviously, goes without stating, form a relationship with a bank that does business in the area that you are doing the housing counseling in. That bank may be willing to have you use their space to conduct the counseling. That bank may want to sponsor a first-time homebuyer seminar or a credit counseling event where they may be able to provide intel to your customers to be able to further their CRA mission. But I also think it's important to understand what a bank's mission statement is. So as an example, if they offer a first-time homebuyer assistance program, getting involved at the beginning of the program to be able to offer that to your customers or your clients to say, if you complete said amount of training or said amount of counseling, you will have access to participate in this bank's program. To me, it's all about the relationship. But CRA is not a competitive space, right? There can never be too many first-time homebuyer programs. There can never be too many credit rehabilitation services offered. There is just a great need, not just in Illinois. So no matter where that you do your business around the housing counseling, there are going to be banks throughout the state that are going to want to focus on their particular market. But we have to remember that CRA is place-based. So if all of your activity is in central Illinois, for example, it doesn't make sense for you to approach a bank that only does business in southern Illinois, because they're going to want those customers and clients in the central part of the state. So be mindful of who you are talking to. Every bank has a CRA officer by title, and getting in touch with that person would be key. But I think the first action item is finding out who the market manager is through your local banker and asking them that same question. Hey, this is what I do. How can we develop a partnership?
Terrific. I think that's good advice. And I hope not only the folks who are on live, but also the folks who are watching this in the recorded fashion are going to be able to make use of that. We've got a couple minutes left. Are there any more questions out there? Feel free to drop them in the chat, or if you want to unmute.
The one question that did come through about what other conditions may impact a modernized CRA, and that is the election coming in November. If there is potentially a change in party oversight, the change to CRA may be triggered, may or may not be. But even if there is a change to what a modernized CRA is, there is nothing to my understanding that will eliminate CRA, okay? CRA has been on the books since 1977, and it's gone through multiple political parties. There is nothing on the table right now that will eliminate CRA. So even if you were an organization that may want to focus on the impact factors or focus on the community development services or anything of the changes, be mindful though that even if a modernized CRA doesn't come to fruition in its current form, something will change because of the digital landscape that we are operating in. So, but yes, could there be changes as a result of the election? I wanted to call that out.
Well, that's a we'll wait and see kind of situation. Okay. Well, listen, I think at this point, well, one more question. Can you explain the lawsuit, an injunction, and which banks were in support of it?
So the lawsuit and the injunction is essentially from the American Bankers Association and some banks in Texas. And essentially what the issue is that they believe that the regulators superseded their authority on putting forward some of the changes. So this happens all the time when there's a regulatory change of this magnitude. But it's not about what any specific bank believes. It is about the aggregation of all banks throughout the country. So while it's easy to to find out which it's not, I'm saying it's not easy to find out which banks are or are not in support. To me, the most important thing is to know that CRA banks have to comply with the current CRA as is, and they may have their own opinions, but they're not likely to share them publicly because they don't want to impact sort of what they're doing to meet the current market need. But that's a good question.
All right. And with that, we are at the 1 o'clock hour. Jason, on behalf of the University of Illinois Extension and Rural Partners, I really want to thank you for your presentation today, informative and full of information. As I mentioned earlier, to the attendees, if you've registered for the webinar, you will automatically receive presentation materials in a follow-up email. If you're not already receiving our email invitations and notices about upcoming webinar offerings, just drop your email into the chat before you go, and we will add you to our email list. For example, coming up on Thursday, this Thursday, May 30th, again at high noon, we are offering the program, second part of a series on this program on the Open Meetings Act. This is a series on public access rules for local government officials. I'd also invite you to visit our website at go.illinois.edu/LGE to access our video archives from prior presentations on a wide variety of community development topics. So with that, thank you all for attending today's webinar. Have a great day, and we hope to see you back for future presentations. Thanks so much.